I hope you're having a great day. You're listening to TechFest Talks, a podcast by students for students. We are Gemma.
Cyan, Esme.
I'm Gemma and I like dancing and music.
I'm Cyan. I like dancing, music, and reading.
I'm Esme and I enjoy hanging out with friends and reading.
And we all go to Peterhead Academy. Today we are excited to interview Paul Garnham, who just retired from the energy industry. Hello, Paul.
First question is, what did you do in your job?
Hi. Okay. Well, I worked for Shell for 40 years, and it would take me all day to explain all the jobs I did. But for the last 14 years, I was working mainly on carbon capture projects, and there were three projects: Longannet, Peterhead, and Acorn. But they were all aiming to store CO2 in the old Goldeneye reservoir, which is offshore from St Fergus. So that's been my main focus for the last, 14 years.
What subjects did you take in order to get the position that you were in?
At university, and this is a long, long time ago, university, I did chemical engineering, which I think is a great subject. It's stood the test of time. It's served me very well. It's a very, shall we say, versatile, flexible subject that opens lots of doors, allows you to do many different roles for many different companies. So I would certainly recommend chemical engineering for any listeners.
What inspired you to choose a career in chemical engineering?
Yeah, that's a good question, Gemma. I think when you're at school, you don't really get exposed to something like chemical engineering. I was doing chemistry and maths and physics, and I probably was planning on doing those at university. But then I took a year out and I worked at a chemical engineering plant, a pilot plant, a fertilizer research station, and that opened my eyes to chemical engineering. I think I was very fortunate that I got that chance to see chemical engineering in action, and it certainly made my mind up for me.
What are the good skills that you need to be an engineer?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say, first of all, that people are individuals. Everyone is different, and the best teams are a blend of different types of person. So there's no one size cookie cutter recipe for what makes a good engineer. Having said that, there are certain attributes such as good analytical skills, good numerate skills, good communication skills, which will stand you in good stead. I think the other thing I would say, I've done a lot of recruitment in my time with Shell, and what we look for is what people have achieved and their relationship skills, by which I don't mean have they got a boyfriend or a girlfriend. I mean, have they worked in a team? Have they led a team? Do they get on well with other people?
During your career, what would your normal day at work look like?
Well, I think people might be surprised that I guess the majority of employees in a company like Shell are actually based in the office. We tend not to work offshore. Of course, there is a large offshore contingent, but probably there's a larger number of people that are office based. So I was predominantly office based. I did serve some years offshore, but I was predominantly office based. And in the office, a lot of it was about communication, about meetings, about emails, about talking at the desk to people, planning a project, and we can go into how a project works, but yeah, essentially a project runs through different phases, and it's a little bit prescriptive how you manage a project.
Where did you go when you went offshore?
Again, it's a long time ago, but I worked on a platform, the Dunlin, and I worked on rigs that float around, semi-submersible rigs, the Stay Drill and the Drill Star, but that is a long time ago.
How do you see the future of oil and gas?
Yeah, that's a cracking question. So I think we all know that we're in a transition period now where the world, the planet needs to get to net zero. In the UK, we have a legally binding target to achieve that by 2050. It's even more stringent in Scotland. The target is 2045. So I think oil and gas, the industry understands that oil and gas production needs to be reduced. and those companies that historically have produced oil and gas are also very well placed to look for alternative sources of energy. So the Shells and the BPs and the Harbours of this world are also very active in pursuing wind power and hydrogen and more sustainable sources of energy.
In general, how do you think the topic of climate change will impact the oil and gas sector?
Yeah, so we just talked about the transitions. I think traditional oil and gas production will slowly be phased out. It will not be a step change. It cannot be a step change. It's a transition that needs to happen over 10 or 20 or 30 or 40 years. And that period can be extended if the CO2 that's emitted can be stored with techniques like carbon capture and storage. So I think the offshore activity, oil and gas production, will gradually reduce. There'll still be offshore activity in the sense of wind generation, and I think a lot of platforms, by reducing their CO2 emissions by electrification, will prolong their lifetimes if they can operate in a mode whereby they are not emitting CO2. Then that is still a sustainable way of producing oil and gas.
What are the major developments that you saw during your career?
I've done a lot of lectures on the topic of looking back in order to predict what the future might be. And I think when you look back 30 or 40 years, you realize there have been some big changes. And the biggest change of all for me has been computing. So when I started 40 years ago, there were computers, but we used to run them by punching holes in a deck of cards, putting the cards in a card reader, and letting the machine run overnight. And the machine was so big it occupied an entire room. And we'd come in the morning, and hopefully the card deck had been read and the program had run. But more often than not, you'd find the cards splattered on the carpet. So I think the way in which computing has changed, and some of the other devices, like we didn't have printers, we didn't have photocopiers when I started. Can you believe that? I had to take um, anything I wanted typed would go to a pool of typists, and they would sit there with their typewriters and type it up, and they would use carbon paper to make copies. So massive changes over 40 years.
Can you see a future for fossil fuels, or do you think they're coming to an end due to renewable energy?
Well, there's certainly going to be a reduction in fossil fuel production and use, but I think one of the conundrum here is that fossil fuels are used for many things, and when we have this conversation, we tend to think about motor cars and petrol, but of course, oil and gas are used for many other things besides. It's a good exercise just to Google what is oil used for, and you might be amazed at the huge spectrum of everyday items that oil and gas are used for. So really random things like lipstick and trainers and tents and sunglasses and deodorant. Um, all of these things are derived from oil and gas, not to mention aviation fuel and bitumen. And so oil and gas will be phased out, but we have to find replacements if we want to continue to use these everyday objects.
What advice would you give to someone who aspires to be an engineer?
The choice of degree subject is really important, and so do your research and make sure you know what it is you're taking on when you go to university. I've done lots of career fairs, and I remember students coming up to me saying, I'd like to be a driller. And I say, well, what degree have you done? And they'll say history. And so that's a little bit of an extreme case, but I think, choose your degree subject carefully. And a subject like chemical engineering is very versatile. It does leave lots of doors open to you, whereas something like chemistry might be a little bit more restricted, for example. So choose your degree carefully, and look for opportunities to do summer jobs or a year out, get that work experience, network, talk to people who are in the industry, build up a network. Does that help?
Yeah. Um, I think you mentioned earlier that you used to plan projects. Like, what were the steps that you used to have to take to do so?
Yeah, well, the way that big companies run big projects is the projects go through phases, and okay, each company is slightly different, but they use a fairly generic pattern of identifying the project, assessing whether it's feasible, and then kind of deciding on exactly what the concept is that they're going to build. And as you move from one phase to another, you have a milestone, and we used to call them a gate. And that gate is quite important because everyone in the company um, has got their eyes on that gate, and everyone is involved. Stakeholders need to sign up to the project going forward. Um, the idea is you don't get any surprises. You don't end up building something that is not feasible or not profitable or not sustainable. So yeah, it's very much a step by step, phase by phase process.
What degrees would you suggest taking in university to get the widest variety of choices?
If we talk about the energy transition, I think yeah, engineering is a really good starting point. It's not the be all and end all, but let's stick with engineering. So chemical engineering, mechanical engineering, electrical engineering, I think will be a key topic as the world electrifies in the next 20 or 30 years. So I think all of those topics they'll be versatile and they'll be very useful.
What kind of work experience would you suggest for someone that is looking to gain experience to join the energy sector?
Yeah, well, first of all, I think any work experience is good. It doesn't have to be directly relevant. As I say, when we were interviewing and assessing graduates for Shell, we were looking for their achievements. And those achievements don't necessarily have to be in the energy industry. It could be, you know, what you've achieved working for a charity, what you've achieved playing in an orchestra, what you've achieved in a sports team. So I think, yeah, any sort of experience is good, but the more relevant it is, then the better. And you know, in Aberdeen, Peterhead, the northeast of Scotland, I think we're well placed for students to get that sort of energy experience. I realise it's easier said than done. There are not a multitude of opportunities, but I would encourage you to work hard to find opportunities and maybe just do a job without necessarily being paid, just to get that experience. The more that you can get experience that you can then put onto your CV, stronger your case for employment becomes.
Why did you want to become a chemical engineer?
Yeah, we touched on this earlier on. I think you know, working. It was a fertilizer research establishment where I was actually um, working on pilot plant. So, if you like, as a chemical plant where the vessels are the size of oil drums as opposed to massive tanks. And we were able to experiment and try different operating conditions and what have you. And that was good fun. You could make mistakes without them being too costly, and it was a great learning environment. So that's really what switched me on to chemical engineering.
Have you always wanted to be a chemical engineer, or did you want to be something else at one point?
Well, yeah, I think when you know when you go through school and you're doing subjects, you know, the traditional school subjects like maths and physics and chemistry and biology, that's probably what's at the front of your mind, and you're probably not thinking about chemical engineering. You're probably not thinking about aeronautical engineering or electrical engineering. So I think there is this little conundrum that some of the best subjects to do at university are not subjects that you get exposed to at school. And so I think that challenge is to get familiar with subjects that are outside the school curriculum, but which are, you know, important subjects at university.
Do the subjects that you take at nationals and hires have like a big impact on being able to enter the engineering sector?
Yes, I think, you know, as you're at school, you go down this. slightly narrowing path. You gradually focusing in on a narrower and narrower subject, so I think you need to be very careful about making those choices, which starts with standard grades, hires, advanced hires. You're narrowing your options, um, but I think sort of the engineering family of subjects, as I've said before, they are very versatile. They do keep opportunities open for you.
Are there any memorable moments during your career that you want to share? Or
Well, yeah, I mean, I know you're all in Peterhead, and there was a famous occasion back in 2014 when David Cameron was the Prime Minister and brought his UK cabinet to the Shell office in Aberdeen under a cloak of secrecy, it has to be said. It was not really advertised until afterwards. And one of the reasons for them doing that was to sign the contract, the contract, that's front end engineering and design contract for the Peterhead project. So that was back in, I think it was February 2014.
What was your favorite moment in being a chemical engineer?
Over the course of 40 or 50 years, there's lots of moments, but I suppose the one that probably had the biggest impact was flying offshore for the first time in a helicopter and looking down through the helicopter window and seeing an oil platform in the middle of the North Sea. A vast empty sea and a tiny oil platform. Yeah, that's quite a vivid memory, I can say.
how many of you went to the oil platform?
Well, I suppose there's all sorts of platforms and rigs with, um, you know, ranging from those that are unmanned to those that maybe have more than 100 people, more than 150 people on board at any one time. And it's probably worth pointing out that yeah, there's essentially a couple of different categories. There's people who are working routinely. They'll do maybe 2 weeks offshore, 2 weeks at home, 2 weeks offshore. They'll be on a rota, and that will be their 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 pattern of life. But there are others who will go offshore on a more ad hoc, um, random basis, not always to the same installation, but maybe depending on their expertise, they might dot around and go to different platforms. When I was offshore, I was doing a week off, week on, and that was quite challenging. It meant you were flying every week. Um, Never really had time to settle, but I think that week on, week off system is probably a thing of the past. It's mostly now 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off, or variations on a theme.
Did you prefer going offshore or working in an office?
Oh, that's an interesting one. I think going offshore in my case for a couple of years was essential in terms of learning about the industry, learning about the equipment, learning the language, because the items of equipment have sometimes got funny names. Yeah, just understanding the challenges of working in that environment. I think that is an absolutely essential grounding. I probably learned more in 2 years offshore than I did in 10 years in the office. For me, I don't think I would have wanted to stay 40 years offshore. I'm not knocking it for some people that is their career, working 30 or 40 years offshore. And yeah, that's fantastic. But I don't think that would have been for me.
Did you enjoy being a chemical engineer?
Oh yes, yes. I hope that's come through from the interview so far. That yeah, it opens lots of doors. I've done lots of really interesting things. Um, yeah, it's I think it's a great subject that I would thoroughly recommend.
I was just going to ask, it's Pam here, is so what other opportunities has being working for the oil and gas industry given you outside work? Has it given you opportunities for travel or expeditions or exciting things that you wouldn't have expected to have done because of opportunities that have opened up because of your work?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So travel you mentioned, and certainly the opportunities for travel have been there. I did one spell of 4 years in the Far East as head of chemistry in Brunei. There were more opportunities had I chosen to take them. So certainly travel, if you're with a large company like Shell, which is a multinational and has operations in 100 different countries, certainly the opportunities for travel are there. But I think also there's the sort of extracurricular things that open up. So, for instance, TechFest, I was on the board of TechFest until just a couple of months ago. 20 years on the board, and 5 of those as chairman. So lots of opportunities in Aberdeen, in Aberdeenshire, which open up when you're working for a company like Shell.
Thank you, Paul, for a informative interview.
Thank you to all of you, Gemma, Esme, Siam, and Pam. Thanks for your time. Good luck with your future careers.
Thanks everyone for listening. Tune in for more episodes from TechFest Talks. Bye for now.